Sarah Jenkins had sworn off prom. The thought of facing Britney Thompson's smirk and the cruel whispers of her classmates was more than she could bear. She was ready to let the night pass quietly until a knock at the door shattered her plan. Standing there was a towering man in a tuxedo, his grin as bold as his presence. "Sarah Jenkins," he said, his deep voice filling the silence. "We need to talk." And in that moment, Sarah's carefully built walls began to crumble, setting the stage for a night that would change everything. Want to know what happens next? Hit subscribe and dive into Sarah's unforgettable journey. Westfield High buzzed with the electricity of prom season. Everywhere Sarah Jenkins turned, she saw the evidence in the form of pastel-colored flyers taped to lockers, girls chattering about corsages, and the steady hum of excitement that filled the hallways. For most of her classmates, it was a time of celebration, a glittering punctuation mark at the end of their senior year. But for Sarah, it was a cruel reminder of how far removed she was from everyone else. The cafeteria was rowdy during lunchtime, as usual. Britney Thompson and her friends, perfectly arranged and dripping with confidence, occupied their usual table in the center of the room. Sarah tried to make herself invisible as she passed by with her tray, but Britney's piercing laugh stopped her in her tracks. "Well, look who it is," Britney called out, her voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. "Sarah the scientist, tell me, did you finally find a lab partner for prom, or are you going with your microscope?" The laughter that followed hit Sarah like a physical blow. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks and kept her eyes glued to the floor. Her hands tightened around the plastic tray as if it were a lifeline. "Don't you think a microscope is too good for her?" one of Britney's friends chimed in, her voice dripping with mockery. "I mean, it's not like it wants to be seen with her in public." Sarah's chest tightened, her appetite vanishing. She knew better than to respond. Anything she said would only make things worse. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, their laughter following her like a shadow. By the time she reached her usual corner of the library, Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. This was her safe space, tucked away behind rows of dusty books where no one would bother her. She dropped her tray on the table and sank into the chair, staring blankly at her uneaten food. She hated this time of year. The frenzy over prom only magnified how much of an outsider she was. Her classmates treated prom as if it were the most important event of their lives, a rite of passage into adulthood. But for Sarah, it was just another reminder that she didn't belong. She pulled her phone out of her bag and scrolled through Instagram, her heart sinking further as she saw the posts. It was filled with pictures of glittering dresses, polished nails, and excited captions about promposals. And then there was Britney, front and center in every post. Sarah couldn't look away from the photos of Britney and her friends laughing in the dress boutique, each gown more beautiful than the last. They looked like they belonged in a magazine, a far cry from Sarah's reality. She had a dress too, though she couldn't imagine ever wearing it now. It hung in the back of her closet, a sleek black gown her mom had helped her pick out months ago when she still believed she might actually go to prom. That felt like a lifetime ago. The next day, Sarah tried to keep her head down. She moved through the hallways like a ghost, avoiding eye contact and praying she wouldn't run into Britney. But as always, her prayers went unanswered. It happened in the chemistry lab. Sarah had stayed after school to finish an experiment for her AP chemistry class, a rare moment of peace in an otherwise chaotic day. She was pouring a solution into a beaker when she heard the door slam open. "Oh, look who's playing mad scientist," Britney sneered, sauntering into the room with her phone in hand. She was alone this time, but that didn't make her any less dangerous. "I'm busy," Sarah said quietly, not looking up from her work. "Aw, is the little nerd too busy for her favorite bully?" Britney's voice dripped with sarcasm as she leaned against the lab table. "You know, Sarah, it's really sad. You could have been normal if you tried harder, but instead, you're just you." Sarah clenched her fists, trying to block out the words. "Honestly," Britney continued, snapping a picture of Sarah with her phone, "I should post this. Most likely to marry a test tube. That's got a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Just leave me alone, Sarah said, her voice trembling. But Britney didn't stop. She never stopped. That night, Sarah locked herself in her bedroom and cried until her chest ached. She had held it together all day, but now, in the privacy of her room, the dam broke. She glanced at the black dress hanging on the back of her closet door. It was beautiful, sleeveless, with a modest neckline and just enough shimmer to make her feel special. She had loved it when she first tried it on. Now, it felt like a cruel joke. Pulling out her phone, she opened a text to her best and only friend, Emily. "Hey, I don't think I'm going to prom anymore. Sorry." She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the send button. Emily had been so excited about their plans. She had even convinced Sarah to do matching corsages, but Sarah couldn't do it. She couldn't face the possibility of Britney humiliating her in front of the entire school. She hit send and sat curled up on her bed, staring at the faint glow of her phone screen. Emily's reply to her text blinked back at her. "What do you mean you're not going? You've been planning this for months. Don't let Britney ruin it." Sarah sighed. Emily didn't understand. How could she? Emily was everything Sarah wasn't. Confident, outgoing, and unbothered by the opinions of people like Britney. Sarah admired her for it, but she couldn't summon that same courage. Her thumbs hovered over the screen as she typed and retyped her response. "I'm just not feeling it anymore. I'll explain later." She hit send and immediately put the phone face down on the bed, not wanting to see Emily's reaction. "Why does it have to be like this?" she whispered, to no one in particular. The days leading up to prom were a blur of avoidance and anxiety. Sarah skipped lunch to avoid the cafeteria and spent her free periods in the library. She even faked a stomachache to get out of gym class. Across the room, the black dress hung in silent mockery. Sarah had bought it on a rare outing with her mom, who had been thrilled to see her take an interest in something other than schoolwork. "I love it," her mom had said, her eyes sparkling as Sarah twirled in front of the mirror. "You're going to look stunning, sweetheart." At the time, Sarah had believed her. She had imagined herself walking into prom, head held high, maybe even shocking everyone with how good she looked. But now, the thought of standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by classmates who only saw her as a punchline, made her stomach twist. She got up and crossed the room, yanking the dress off its hanger. Holding it in her hands, she felt a pang of regret. It really was beautiful. For a moment, she considered trying it on, just to see. But then she shoved it into the back of her closet and slammed the door shut. Emily called her later that evening. "Hey," Emily said, her voice soft but urgent. "I need you to explain what's going on. You were so excited about prom, and now you're just giving up?" "It's not like that," Sarah said, pulling her knees to her chest. "Then what is it like?" Emily pressed. "This isn't just about Britney, is it?" Sarah hesitated. Emily was the one person she could talk to about anything, but even she didn't know the full extent of what Sarah had been through. "I just don't want to go," Sarah said finally. "I don't want to be there with everyone staring at me, laughing behind my back." "Sarah, no one's going to." "They always do, Emily," Sarah snapped, surprising even herself. "They've been doing it for years. Britney, her stupid friends, everyone. I don't belong there." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I just can't do it." Emily sighed. "I hate seeing you like this. You deserve to have a good time, Sarah. I just wish you could see that." After they hung up, Sarah felt worse than ever. Emily's disappointment weighed on her, but it didn't change her mind. The night before prom, Sarah tried to distract herself with homework, but her mind kept drifting back to the dress, Emily's words, and Britney's laughter. She thought about her parents, who had always encouraged her to embrace her intelligence, even when it made her an outcast. Her dad used to tell her, "The people who matter will see your worth, Sarah. Don't let the rest get to you." But that was easier said than done. Every cruel comment, every mocking laugh had chipped away at her confidence until there was almost nothing left. She wondered what her dad would say if he were still here. He'd passed away when she was 12, leaving a gaping hole in her life that nothing had filled. Her mom tried her best, but she was always busy with work, leaving Sarah to fend for herself most of the time. Maybe if her dad were still around, she would have had the strength to stand up to Britney. Maybe she wouldn't feel so alone. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a mistake. Maybe if she were braver, she could go and prove Britney wrong. But the fear of public humiliation was too much. Then came the knock. It was loud, urgent, and completely unexpected. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who could possibly be at her door at this hour? The knock came again, more insistent this time. It wasn't her mom. She was working the night shift at the hospital. And Emily wouldn't show up unannounced, especially not this late. "Who is it?" Sarah called, her voice trembling. "It's Big Shaq," the voice replied, deep and unfamiliar. Sarah froze. "Who?" She crept toward the door, her bare feet making no sound on the carpet. She glanced through the peephole, but saw nothing but darkness. "Open up, Sarah," the voice said again, softer this time. Something about it made her pause. It wasn't threatening exactly. If anything, it sounded kind and reassuring. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob. Every instinct told her not to open it, but curiosity gnawed at her. Who was this person? How did they know her name? Finally, she took a deep breath and opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man, unlike anyone she had ever seen. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a presence that filled the small space. He wore a dark suit that looked slightly too tight, as if it had been borrowed or hastily bought. "Who?" Sarah began, but the words caught in her throat. The man smiled, a warm, almost goofy grin that seemed out of place on someone so imposing. "Big Shaq," he said again, as if that explained everything. "I'm here to help." "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, clutching the doorframe for support. "I heard you're not going to prom," Big Shaq said, his expression softening. "Thought I'd stop by and see if I could change your mind." Sarah blinked, utterly baffled. "How do you even know about that? Who are you?" "Let's just say I've got a knack for knowing when people need a little push," he said with a shrug. "And tonight, that person is you." "This is insane," Sarah muttered, shaking her head. "I don't even know you." "You don't need to," Big Shaq said. "But trust me when I say this. You're going to prom, and it's going to be a night you'll never forget." Sarah stared at him, torn between slamming the door and bursting out laughing. This had to be some kind of prank, right? Maybe Britney had sent him. But something about his eyes stopped her. There was no malice there, no hint of mockery, just an unshakable certainty that made her chest tighten. "Why do you care?" she whispered. "Because everyone deserves to shine," Big Shaq said simply. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a flicker of something other than fear or despair. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. Still, she wasn't ready to say yes. Not yet. "I don't think I can do it," she said finally. Big Shaq smiled again, this time with a hint of mischief. "We'll see about that." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway, her mind racing. Sarah sat on her bed, staring at the empty doorway where Big Shaq had just stood. His words echoed in her mind. Everyone deserves to shine. She hugged her knees to her chest, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, doubt, and something she hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. As the house grew quiet, her mind wandered back to the person she used to be, long before Britney Thompson and her clique had reduced her to a shadow of herself. When Sarah was 8, she'd built her first science project entirely on her own: a homemade solar oven. It was a simple contraption, made from a pizza box, aluminum foil, and some black construction paper. But to Sarah, it felt like magic. She remembered the way her dad had clapped when she showed him the tiny s'mores she had baked in the oven. "That's my girl," he had said, ruffling her hair. "A genius in the making." Her dad, a physicist with an insatiable curiosity for the universe, had been her first teacher. They would spend hours together in the garage, tinkering with wires and circuits, building rudimentary robots, and conducting messy chemistry experiments that often left the entire room smelling like vinegar. "Science is all about asking questions," he used to say. "And you, Sarah, ask the best questions." Those words had stayed with her, fueling her passion even after he was gone. By the time Sarah reached middle school, her love for science had made her an outlier. While other kids were obsessing over crushes and social media, Sarah spent her weekends immersed in science books or watching documentaries about black holes. Her peers didn't understand her, and worse, they didn't want to. She became the girl who was too smart, too weird, and too much for the social hierarchy of adolescence. The teasing started small, whispers behind her back, giggles when she raised her hand in class. But as she got older, the ridicule grew sharper, more personal. In 7th grade, a group of boys had stolen her notebook during lunch and read aloud the detailed notes she had written about potential science fair projects. "Who writes about quantum mechanics for fun?" one of them had jeered. She'd never felt more humiliated. The final blow came during her freshman year, when her mom encouraged her to enter the Westfield science competition. Sarah had poured months into her project, building a working prototype of a water filtration system for underdeveloped communities. She had won first place, but instead of celebrating, she became a target. "Sarah the scientist strikes again," Britney had sneered in front of the entire cafeteria. "Do you ever do anything normal? Like, I don't know, talk to people?" From that moment on, Sarah stopped trying to fit in. It was easier to hide in the library or the chemistry lab, where no one could judge her. She focused on her studies, her passion for science becoming both her refuge and her prison. Her mom, a high school biology teacher, tried her best to support Sarah, but she was often preoccupied with work. After her dad's death, she had taken on extra shifts to make ends meet, leaving little time for mother-daughter bonding. "You're going to change the world one day, Sarah," her mom would say whenever she saw her daughter buried in a textbook. But as much as Sarah appreciated her mom's faith in her, it also added pressure. If she wasn't brilliant, who was she? Sarah thought about all the times she had come close to breaking free from her shell, only to retreat at the last second, like the time Emily had dragged her to a party during sophomore year. Sarah had spent the entire evening clutching a soda can in the corner, too nervous to talk to anyone. Or the time a boy named Ryan had tried to strike up a conversation with her in English class. She had been so shocked that someone was genuinely interested in her that she had stumbled over her words, too flustered to respond. He hadn't tried again. Now, sitting on her bed, Sarah realized how much she had let fear dictate her life. Britney wasn't the only one keeping her from going to prom. Sarah had built her own walls, brick by brick, and she didn't know how to tear them down. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Emily. "Please don't do this. You'll regret it forever." Sarah stared at the message, guilt gnawing at her. She hated disappointing Emily, but the thought of walking into prom, with Britney and her friends waiting to tear her apart, was unbearable. And yet, she couldn't stop thinking about Big Shaq. Who was he? And why had he shown up on her doorstep, of all places? The next morning, Sarah woke up to another knock at the door. This time, it was daylight, and the sound startled her less. She opened the door cautiously, half expecting Big Shaq to be gone like a dream. But there he was, grinning down at her with the same warm, almost goofy smile. "Morning, Sarah," he said, holding up a paper bag. "I brought bagels. Thought we could talk." Sarah blinked at him. "You brought me bagels?" "What can I say? I'm a guy who likes breakfast," he said with a shrug. Before she could protest, he stepped inside, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "Okay, here's the deal," Big Shaq said, leaning against the counter like they were old friends. "You're not going to let some mean girls decide your future, okay? You're going to prom, and I'm going to help you." Sarah crossed her arms. "Why do you care?" "Because I've been where you are," Big Shaq said, his voice softer now. "I know what it's like to feel small, to think you're not enough. But let me tell you something, Sarah. You're more than enough. You just need to see it for yourself." His words hit her harder than she expected. "What if I can't?" she whispered. Big Shaq smiled. "That's what I'm here for." For the first time in years, Sarah felt a tiny spark of hope. She wasn't sure if she believed Big Shaq, but she wanted to. As they sat at the kitchen table, eating bagels and talking about everything from her love of science to her fear of facing Britney, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as powerless as she thought. By the time Big Shaq left that morning, Sarah felt like her world had tilted on its axis. The towering man with the quick smile and warm voice was unlike anyone she had ever met. He had stayed for over an hour, listening to her talk about Britney, prom, and the way she felt like she didn't belong anywhere. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer cliches or shallow reassurances. He just listened, nodding now and then, as if her words mattered. Before he left, he had stood in the doorway, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "Think about what I said," he had told her. "You don't have to let fear win. Not this time." Now, sitting at the kitchen table with the remains of their bagel breakfast, Sarah replayed the conversation in her mind. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she could walk into that gym and face Britney and the others without shrinking under their judgment. But wanting wasn't the same as doing. That afternoon, Emily showed up at Sarah's house unannounced, her arms crossed and her expression a mix of frustration and concern. "Okay, spill," Emily said, marching into the living room. "Who's this guy you've been talking to?" Sarah blinked. "How do you know about him?" "Your mom," Emily said, flopping onto the couch. "She called me this morning, all freaked out about some strange man eating bagels in her kitchen." Sarah groaned. She should have known her mom wouldn't let this slide. "So," Emily pressed, "who is he? And why does he care about whether or not you go to prom?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how to explain Big Shaq without sounding insane. "He just showed up last night. He said he wants to help me. That's all I know." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And you're okay with this?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "He's weird, but in a good way. Like, he actually listens, and he makes me feel like maybe I can do this." Emily's expression softened. "Sarah, I've been telling you that for weeks. You didn't need some random guy to convince you." "I know," Sarah said quickly, "but it's different with him. He's not just saying it, he believes it." Emily sighed, leaning back against the cushions. "Look, if he's helping you, then great. But you need to make this decision for yourself, Sarah. No one can do it for you. Not me, not him. It has to be you." That evening, Sarah heard the knock again. She wasn't startled this time. Part of her had been waiting for it. When she opened the door, Big Shaq was standing there with the same easy grin, holding what looked like a garment bag. "What's that?" Sarah asked, eyeing the bag suspiciously. "Your ticket to prom," Big Shaq said, stepping inside. He unzipped the bag with a flourish, revealing a sleek midnight blue tuxedo. Sarah frowned. "I already have a dress." Big Shaq laughed, a deep, booming sound that filled the small living room. "Not for you, Sarah. For me." "You're going to prom?" "Of course," Big Shaq said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Someone's got to have your back." Sarah stared at him, completely dumbfounded. "You can't just show up at a high school prom." "Why not?" Big Shaq asked, shrugging. "I've been to worse parties." The absurdity of the situation almost made Sarah laugh. Here was this stranger, a man she had known for less than 24 hours, acting as though it were perfectly normal to crash a high school prom in a tuxedo. But as ridiculous as it was, there was something oddly comforting about the idea. For the first time, she wouldn't be walking into the lion's den alone. "Do you really think I can do this?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Big Shaq crouched down so they were at eye level, his expression serious. "I know you can. The question is, do you?" Sarah looked away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I don't know." "That's okay," Big Shaq said gently. "Sometimes, you don't have to know. You just have to try." Over the next hour, Big Shaq outlined his plan. It wasn't just about showing up to prom. It was about showing up as the best version of herself. "We're going to turn some heads, Sarah," he said, his grin widening. "But first, we need to get you ready." Sarah's stomach twisted with nerves. The idea of walking into prom still terrified her, but Big Shaq's confidence was infectious. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. I'm not promising anything, she said, crossing her arms. Big Shaq winked. That's all I ask. That night, as Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to walk into prom without fear. She pictured herself in her black dress, her shoulders back and her head held high. She imagined Britney's stunned expression, the whispers of her classmates as they realized she wasn't the same girl they had spent years mocking. For the first time, the thought didn't seem impossible. She still had doubts, plenty of them, but they were starting to feel smaller, less overwhelming. As she turned off the bathroom light and climbed into bed, Sarah found herself thinking about what Big Shaq had said. Sometimes you don't have to know. You just have to try. And for the first time in a long time, she wanted to try. Sarah woke up the next morning with a nervous ache in her stomach. The day of the prom had arrived, and no amount of sleep could erase the doubt swirling in her mind. Big Shaq was waiting for her downstairs, lounging on the couch with a newspaper he had probably borrowed from a neighbor. "Morning, sunshine," he said brightly as she shuffled into the room. "Ready for the big day?" Sarah groaned, sinking into the armchair opposite him. "I don't think I can do this." "Wrong attitude," Big Shaq said, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "Good thing we've got all day to fix it." The first part of Big Shaq's transformation plan was surprisingly simple. He led Sarah to the full-length mirror in her mom's bedroom and told her to stand in front of it. "What do you see?" he asked, his tone serious for once. Sarah stared at her reflection, her heart sinking. "I see me." Big Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And what's wrong with that?" "Everything," Sarah said quietly. She gestured vaguely at her reflection. "I'm awkward, plain, boring. I'm not like Britney and her friends. I don't fit in." Big Shaq sighed, crossing his arms. "You're looking at the wrong things, Sarah. You're focused on what you think you're not. Try looking at what you are." She frowned, unsure what he meant. "Look closer," Big Shaq urged. "I see a girl who's smart, determined, and braver than she realizes. I see someone who's about to walk into prom and make those bullies eat their words. But none of that matters, unless you see it too." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. She didn't know if she could see what he did, but she wanted to. After an awkward but heartfelt pep talk, Big Shaq insisted it was time for Sarah to try on her dress. "Let's see what we're working with," he said, grinning as he gestured toward the stairs. Sarah hesitated, the memory of the dress hanging untouched in her closet, weighing heavily on her mind. "Come on," Big Shaq said gently. "It's just a dress, Sarah. It's not magic, but it's a start." With a deep breath, she retrieved the dress and slipped into it, her hands trembling as she zipped it up. When she stepped back into the living room, Big Shaq's face lit up. "Now we're talking," he said, clapping his hands. "You look like $1,000,000. Sarah glanced down at herself, unsure how to feel. The dress fit perfectly, the fabric hugging her figure in all the right places. For the first time, she felt a flicker of confidence, a tiny spark that Big Shaq immediately fanned into a flame. "All right, we've got the look down," Big Shaq said, pacing the room like a coach preparing his star athlete for a big game. "Now we need the attitude." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The attitude?" "Exactly," he said. "You can wear the fanciest dress in the world, but if you don't believe you belong at that prom, no one else will either." He handed her a book, one of her old science textbooks. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked. "Pretend it's Britney," he said with a wink. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to yell at a book?" "Not just yell," Big Shaq said. "Tell it everything you've been holding back, all the things you wish you could say to her. Get it out of your system." It felt ridiculous at first, but as Sarah started speaking, the words came tumbling out faster than she could stop them. "I hate the way you treat me," she said, her voice shaking. "I hate that you make me feel small just because you're scared of people who are different. I hate that I've let you get in my head for so long." By the time she finished, her cheeks were flushed, and her chest felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Big Shaq nodded approvingly. "Now that's what I'm talking about. You've got fire in you, Sarah. You just needed a little push. The final step was hair and makeup, a process that Sarah insisted she could handle on her own. Big Shaq didn't argue. Instead, he busied himself polishing his tuxedo and humming an upbeat tune. When Sarah emerged from the bathroom an hour later, she barely recognized herself. Her hair was pulled back into an elegant updo, and a subtle touch of makeup highlighted her natural beauty without overwhelming it. Big Shaq's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "You look like a queen," he declared, bowing dramatically. Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "You're ridiculous." "Ridiculously right," he said with a wink. As the evening approached, Sarah's nerves returned with a vengeance. She paced the living room, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "What if they laugh at me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They won't," Big Shaq said firmly. "What if I trip? Then you get back up and keep going. What if—" "Sarah," Big Shaq interrupted, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've spent your whole life worrying about what other people think. Tonight, you're doing this for you. Not for them, not for me. For you." She took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's do this." Big Shaq insisted on driving her to prom in a car he had somehow acquired during the day, a sleek black sedan that looked wildly out of place in Sarah's quiet neighborhood. "Where did you even get this?" she asked as they pulled out of the driveway. "Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to," Big Shaq said with a grin. The drive to the school was quiet, the air between them charged with a mix of excitement and apprehension. As they approached the parking lot, Sarah's heart began to race. "This is it," Big Shaq said, pulling to a stop. "Ready to make an entrance?" Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. "What if I can't do it?" Big Shaq smiled, his eyes full of unwavering confidence. "You already have." The parking lot was alive with the chatter of students dressed in their finest. Sarah hesitated as she stepped out of the car, clutching her small black clutch like a shield. Her black dress shimmered faintly in the evening light, and the gentle breeze lifted a stray curl from her carefully styled hair. Big Shaq appeared beside her, adjusting the cuffs of his midnight blue tuxedo. His towering presence was impossible to ignore, and Sarah felt a flicker of comfort knowing he was there. "You've got this," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. Sarah nodded, though her heart pounded against her ribcage like a drum. Together, they made their way to the entrance, where the sounds of music and laughter spilled out onto the steps. As they reached the doors, Sarah took a deep breath and stepped inside. The gymnasium had been transformed into a glittering wonderland. Strings of fairy lights crisscrossed the ceiling, and the air smelled faintly of roses and citrus punch. Sarah scanned the crowd, searching for familiar faces. It didn't take long to spot Britney Thompson and her clique, who were holding court near the dance floor. Britney looked as flawless as ever, her sequined gold dress catching the light with every movement. Sarah's stomach twisted. She could already feel their eyes on her, like vultures circling their prey. "Remember," Big Shaq murmured as they walked in, "you're not here for them. You're here for you." His words grounded her, and she straightened her spine, forcing herself to walk with purpose. The first whispers started almost immediately. "Is that Sarah Jenkins? No way. She actually showed up? She looks different." The comments were a mix of surprise, confusion, and begrudging admiration. Sarah felt the weight of their stares, but she kept her gaze forward, refusing to let their opinions define her. When they reached the refreshment table, Big Shaq grabbed 2 cups of punch and handed one to her. "Not bad for a grand entrance," he said with a wink. Sarah smiled faintly, her nerves still buzzing. It wasn't long before Britney made her move. "Well, well," Britney said, sauntering over with her signature smirk. Her friends trailed behind her like shadows. "Look who decided to show up. I almost didn't recognize you, Sarah. Guess even a microscope needs a makeover sometimes." Laughter rippled through the group, but Sarah didn't flinch this time. "Hi, Britney," Sarah said evenly, meeting her gaze for the first time in years. The calmness in Sarah's voice seemed to catch Britney off guard. She blinked, her smirk faltering for just a moment before she recovered. "So, who's your date?" Britney asked, eyeing Big Shaq with thinly veiled disdain. "He doesn't look like he goes to school here." "He's my friend," Sarah said simply. "Your friend," Britney repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. "You had to bring an adult to prom? That's pathetic, even for you." Sarah's chest tightened, but Big Shaq stepped forward, his towering frame making Britney take an involuntary step back. "Nice dress," he said casually, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Gold's a bold choice. Matches your personality." Britney blinked again, clearly unsure whether to take it as a compliment or an insult. "Let's go," Sarah said, brushing past Britney without another word. As they walked away, Sarah's heart raced, but it wasn't from fear. It was from exhilaration. For the first time, she hadn't let Britney's words get to her. Big Shaq leaned down and whispered, "See? You've got more strength than you think." Sarah nodded, her confidence growing with every step. As the night went on, Sarah found herself loosening up. She danced with Emily, laughed at Big Shaq's exaggerated moves on the dance floor, and even joined in a group photo. She had just returned to the refreshment table when a voice behind her made her turn. "Hey, Sarah!" It was Ryan, the boy from her English class, the one who had tried to talk to her years ago. He was wearing a classic black tuxedo, his brown eyes warm and sincere. "Hi," Sarah said, her cheeks flushing slightly. "You look amazing," Ryan said, scratching the back of his neck nervously. "Thank you," Sarah said, her heart fluttering. "Do you want to dance?" he asked, holding out his hand. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Then she glanced at Big Shaq, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Sure," she said, placing her hand in Ryan's. Dancing with Ryan felt surreal. The music swelled around them, and for the first time, Sarah felt like she belonged. Ryan didn't seem to care about her past or her reputation. He just saw her. As they swayed to the music, Sarah caught a glimpse of Britney watching them from across the room, her expression unreadable. When the song ended, Britney approached Sarah once again, her smile brittle. "So, Sarah," she said, her voice sweet but insincere, "I guess you're not as hopeless as I thought. Good for you." The backhanded compliment was clearly meant to sting, but Sarah didn't take the bait. "Thanks, Britney," she said, her tone neutral. "You look great, too. I hope you're enjoying the night." Britney opened her mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. With a flick of her hair, she walked away. As the night wore on, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had faced her fears, stood up to her bullies, and allowed herself to have fun. When the final song played and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found Big Shaq waiting for her by the doors. "Not bad, Jenkins," he said, grinning. "Not bad at all." "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice full of gratitude. "For everything." Big Shaq gave her a mock bow. "Anytime, kid, anytime." The night air was crisp and cool as Sarah stepped out of the gymnasium. The noise of the prom, the music, and the laughter of her classmates faded into the background as she walked toward the car where Big Shaq was waiting. Her feet ached from dancing, and her heart was still racing with the thrill of the night. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. As she approached the car, Big Shaq rolled down the window, his grin as wide as ever. "How'd it feel, kid?" Sarah leaned against the door, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It felt good, really good." "I told you," he said, his tone teasing but warm. "You had it in you all along." Sarah laughed softly. "I think I just needed someone to remind me." The drive home was quiet but comfortable. Sarah watched the world blur by outside the window, her mind replaying the events of the night. She thought about Britney, the way her insults had felt smaller, less significant. She thought about Ryan, who had looked at her like she was worth noticing. And she thought about herself, standing tall in her black dress, unafraid for the first time in a long time. "Do you think they'll change?" Sarah asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Who?" Big Shaq asked. Britney and her friends, Sarah said. Do you think they'll stop being like that? Big Shaq was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the wheel. Maybe, maybe not. People like Britney usually act the way they do because they're scared of being vulnerable, scared of losing control. But that's not your problem, Sarah. What matters is that you've changed. Sarah nodded, letting his words sink in. The next morning, Sarah woke up to sunlight streaming through her window. For the first time, in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the familiar weight of dread pressing down on her. She got up and stretched, glancing at the black dress draped over the back of her chair. It still shimmered faintly in the light, a reminder of the night that had changed everything. Downstairs, her mom was sipping coffee at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as Sarah entered, her eyes softening. "Good morning," her mom said. "How was it?" "It was amazing," Sarah said, a smile breaking across her face. Her mom reached out and squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. I hope you know how special you are." For once, Sarah didn't feel the urge to brush off the compliment. "Thanks, Mom." When Sarah walked into Westfield High on Monday morning, she half expected everything to go back to the way it was. She braced herself for the whispers, the stares, the mocking laughter. But something was different. The hallways felt quieter. As she passed groups of students, she noticed a few nods of acknowledgement, even a smile or two. Emily caught up to her by her locker, practically bouncing with excitement. "Everyone's talking about you, Sarah," she said, her eyes sparkling. "They couldn't believe how amazing you looked. You completely stole the show." Sarah's cheeks flushed, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. "I wasn't trying to steal anything," she said. "I know," Emily said, "and that's what makes it even better." Later that day, Sarah ran into Britney in the hallway. It was an awkward moment, their eyes meeting for a split second before Britney looked away. For a moment, Sarah considered saying something, offering an olive branch or even just a polite hello. But then she realized she didn't need to. Britney's opinion of her no longer mattered. That evening, Sarah heard the now familiar knock at the door. She opened it to find Big Shaq standing there, his hands in his pockets and a rare look of seriousness on his face. "Hey," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Hey, kid," he said, leaning against the door frame. "I just wanted to check in, make sure you're still riding that high." "I am," Sarah said honestly. "Thanks to you." Big Shaq shook his head. "Don't thank me. You did the hard part. I just gave you a little push." "Still," Sarah said, crossing her arms, "you showed up when I needed someone the most. Why? Why me?" Big Shaq hesitated, his gaze dropping for the first time since she'd met him. It was a small thing, but it made her heart race. "What is it?" she asked, stepping closer. He sighed deeply, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jacket. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you, but you deserve to know." "Know what?" Big Shaq looked up, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "I knew your father." The words hit her like a sudden gust of wind. She blinked, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. "I knew your dad," Big Shaq repeated, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "We were friends. Not just casual ones either. He was one of my best buddies." Sarah stared at him, her thoughts racing. Her father had passed away years ago, leaving behind a void that nothing had ever filled. She had never heard of Big Shaq before. How could he have been so close to her dad without her knowing? "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and frustration. Big Shaq's smile was bittersweet. "Because this wasn't about me or your dad. It was about you. Your dad. He asked me for a favor a long time ago. He said, 'If anything ever happens to me, make sure Sarah knows she's special. Make sure she remembers she's strong.'" Sarah felt her throat tighten, tears welling in her eyes. "He said that?" "Yeah," Big Shaq said, his voice softening. "Your dad saw something in you, even when you were little. He used to brag about you all the time, how smart you were, how curious. He knew you were going to do great things, Sarah, and he wanted to make sure you never forgot that, no matter what life threw at you." The tears spilled over now, sliding down her cheeks. She wiped at them furiously, but the emotion kept coming in waves. I miss him so much, she whispered. I know, Big Shaq said gently. And so did he. But he didn't want you to carry the weight of that loss alone. That's why I'm here. Sarah looked up at him, her vision blurry. You're leaving now, though. Doesn't that mean I'm alone again? Big Shaq shook his head, his expression resolute. You'll never be alone, Sarah. Your dad's love, it's still with you. Always. And now, so is everything you've learned about yourself. You're stronger than you realize. You don't need me to keep proving it. She nodded slowly, his words sinking into her heart like a balm. You'll be just fine without me. With that, he stepped back onto the porch, his figure fading into the twilight. As Sarah closed the door, she felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, sadness, and a quiet sense of peace. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. That night, as she sat at her desk sketching ideas for her next science project, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She looked different, not because of her hair or makeup, but because of the confidence in her eyes. For the first time, she felt like the person her dad had always believed she could be. A week after prom, life at Westfield High settled back into its usual rhythm. The glitter of the big night faded, and students returned to stressing over finals and college applications. But for Sarah Jenkins, everything felt different. She walked the halls with a sense of purpose she had never known before. She wasn't invisible anymore, not because people suddenly admired her, but because she no longer hid herself. Emily noticed the change right away. "You're walking taller," she said one afternoon as they sat on the bleachers during lunch. "I feel taller," Sarah said, grinning. "You know what I love?" Emily said, nudging her shoulder. "You don't care what anyone thinks anymore. It's like Britney and her crew don't even exist to you." "They don't," Sarah said simply. "Not in the way they used to. I can't control what they think of me, but I can control how much space I let them take up in my head." Emily beamed at her. "Look at you, getting all wise on me." Sarah laughed, but she knew Emily was right. She had changed. That evening, Sarah sat at her desk, flipping through her old journals. She hadn't opened them in years, but now she felt ready. Each page was filled with detailed notes and sketches of experiments she had wanted to try, ideas for science projects, and entries about her dreams of becoming a scientist. But there were also pages filled with self-doubt and pain. Words written in the wake of Britney's cruelest comments, scrawled reminders to stay out of sight, to avoid drawing attention. Sarah traced her fingers over the ink, her heart aching for the girl she used to be. She had spent so much of her life letting fear dictate her choices, letting other people's opinions shape her sense of self, but not anymore. Later that night, Sarah pulled out a piece of stationery and began to write. "Dear Dad, I went to prom. I wish you could have seen it. I wore the dress Mom helped me pick out, the black one we both loved. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I felt like me. There's this guy, Big Shaq. He showed up at my door the night before prom and somehow convinced me to go. He's gone now, but he helped me see myself in a way I never could before. I think you would have liked him. I'm learning to be brave, Dad. I'm learning to trust that I'm enough, just as I am. I hope you'd be proud of me. Love, Sarah." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box on her desk, the one where she kept her most precious memories of her dad. The next day, Sarah sat in her chemistry class, her mind buzzing with ideas for her summer project. Her teacher had suggested entering the state science fair, and for the first time, she wasn't hesitant. She glanced out the window, her thoughts drifting to Big Shaq. She still didn't know exactly who he was or why he had chosen to help her, but she didn't need to. What mattered was that he had reminded her of something she had forgotten: her own strength. That evening, as Sarah sat at her desk sketching designs for her project, she heard a soft knock at the door. Her heart leapt, a mix of excitement and disbelief. She opened the door, but there was no one there, just the faint scent of cologne lingering in the air. On the doorstep was a single piece of paper folded neatly in half. She picked it up and unfolded it, her breath catching as she read the words, scrawled in bold, messy handwriting. "Keep shining, kid." Big Shaq. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Ridiculous," she muttered, but her smile didn't fade. She tucked the note into her desk drawer, feeling a warmth in her chest she couldn't quite explain. As Sarah lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, she felt a quiet sense of peace. Her journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges to face, moments of doubt to overcome. But she was no longer the girl who hid in the library, afraid of the world. She was Sarah Jenkins, and she was ready to shine. If this story resonated with you, share it, leave a comment, and hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire action and spark change. Together, we can challenge the biases that still hold us back.